Inside the glass-walled garage beneath Mercer Tower, Weston Hail stood beside a $20 million supercar with grease on his sleeves and 3 days of unpaid work in his hands. Celeste Mercer glanced at the engine that wouldn't start, told him he'd wasted her time, and Bryce Langston called him a bargain bin mechanic to get a laugh from the room. When Weston set his invoice on the table and asked to be paid, Celeste tore it apart in front of her entire staff and fired him on the spot. 3 days later, she was standing outside his small garage with a trembling voice, saying, "Please, I need you to save my car. Don't look away, because that car wasn't just worth $20 million. It was holding a secret that could destroy everything Celeste had built." The private garage beneath Mercer Tower occupied the entire third sublevel, temperature-controlled and lit like a surgical theater, its polished concrete floors reflecting the shapes of 6 of the rarest automobiles ever assembled on American soil. Celeste Mercer had inherited the collection from her father, Sterling Mercer, who had spent 30 years and a considerable portion of his early fortune acquiring machines that most people would never see outside a museum catalog. Machines that existed less as transportation than as compressed time, proof that certain moments in engineering could be frozen and owned. The crown of that collection sat at the far end of the row, the Aurelian V12X, a prototype supercar that had never gone into production, never been replicated, and never been driven by anyone outside a closed test circuit in the Nevada desert. Appraisers had valued it at $20 million, but Celeste knew that figure was provisional. In the hands of the right buyer at the right moment, it could be worth considerably more, and the right moment was now. In 48 hours, the annual Malibu Charity Showcase would put the Aurelian in front of collectors, investors, and cameras that would carry its image across every major automotive publication in the country, and Celeste needed it to run perfectly. Weston Hail arrived in a truck with a cracked taillight, carrying a single duffel of tools, wearing a jacket that had seen several hundred oil changes. The security team logged him as a contracted technician and issued him a temporary badge with Level 2 clearance, which meant he could access the car, but not the parts storage vault without an escort. He had been called in because the 2 premium garages Celeste normally used had both declined the job. One said they lacked documentation for the Aurelian's proprietary ignition architecture. The other said they needed 6 weeks minimum, and Weston had said he could be there in 2 hours and quoted a 3-day rate that one of Celeste's assistants described as surprisingly modest. Nobody asked why he knew the car's system. Nobody asked much about him at all. He was a single father from a suburb east of the city, quiet, rarely seen in professional circles, and the only thing visible about him was that his hands were always either working or about to be. He opened the engine compartment and spent the first 20 minutes doing nothing but looking, which made Bryce Langston visibly impatient. Bryce was the CFO of Mercer Global Ventures, a man who measured competence in speed and surface confidence, and a mechanic who stood still made him uneasy. He told Weston twice that the car needed to be ready for a stage introduction in under 3 hours, and Weston replied both times with the same brief nod that communicated nothing except that he had heard. What Weston was actually doing in those 20 minutes was reading the engine the way a surgeon reads a patient, noting what was out of place, what had been touched recently, what shouldn't have moved but had, and the picture that assembled itself in those 20 minutes was not the picture of a machine that had simply broken down. He found it on the third careful look. A secondary control module in the dual start system had been removed and reinstalled incorrectly, not from damage or wear but from deliberate handling. The car hadn't broken. Someone had rearranged it. He needed more time and the original technical documentation, and he asked Tessa Holloway, Celeste's personal assistant, if she could pull the original technical file on the Aurelian. Bryce intercepted that request and said the technical file wasn't relevant. What was relevant was whether the mechanic could start the car or not. Weston said that attempting to start the car before understanding the fault could destroy the original engine, and Bryce said that was exactly what a technician said when he was over his head and needed an excuse. When Celeste walked in moments later, the atmosphere had already curdled, and she looked at Weston the way people look at something that is merely in their way. By early afternoon, Weston had confirmed what he suspected. The secondary control module in the Aurelian's dual ignition system had not failed, but had been fitted with a component that was not original to the car. A convincing substitute, machined to but functionally incompatible, designed to prevent the engine from completing its startup sequence without announcing itself dramatically. He wrote up his findings on a single page, requested the parts inventory, and asked Tessa to arrange a brief meeting with Celeste to walk through the problem before anyone attempted another start. Tessa said she would pass it along. Bryce intercepted the note, read it in full, folded it into his jacket pocket, and told Weston that Celeste would be informed when there was something worth informing her about. The afternoon deteriorated from there. Bryce gathered a small group of assistants near the workbench and delivered a quiet monologue about contractors who accepted work beyond their skill level, and then attributed the failure to missing parts or proprietary complexity. He didn't say Weston's name. He didn't have to. Two of the assistants laughed. One of the security guards smirked in Weston's direction, and Weston continued working without changing his expression, though something quiet shifted behind his eyes, the kind of stillness that comes not from indifference but from a man who has already decided exactly where the line is. He placed his 3-day invoice on the workbench when Celeste returned to the garage late that afternoon. The event deadline had passed, and the car would not start. He explained, briefly and without apology, that the work he had done was diagnostic, thorough, and accurate, and that the car's failure to start was not the result of his performance, but the result of a tampering problem that predated his arrival by at least several days. He asked to be paid for what he had completed. Celeste looked at the invoice for 3 seconds, then looked at Bryce, who offered a small, practiced shrug that said everything without saying anything. Celeste said she did not pay for unfinished work. What happened next took less than 30 seconds and would cost her considerably more than the invoice. She took the payment voucher that Tessa had already prepared. Tessa had done this quietly on her own, reading the room, and tore it in a single clean motion and dropped the pieces into the wastebasket at the corner of the workbench. She told Weston he was dismissed and should clear his tools before the evening staff arrived. The room was not crowded, but it was not empty. 5 people saw it. 5 people who worked for Celeste, who would remember. Weston removed his gloves 1 finger at a time, set them on the workbench beside his tools, picked up his duffel, and looked at Celeste for a moment with an expression that held no anger and no submission. Just a clean, flat attention that was somehow more uncomfortable than either. He set his temporary access card on the workbench, then the spare diagnostic key he'd been issued, and said 7 words before walking out. 3 days from now, you'll wish you'd paid me. Celeste heard it the way people hear predictions they're certain won't happen, as the last bluster of someone who had run out of better options. Bryce watched Weston leave and allowed himself a small, private smile, directed at no one. Tessa looked at the torn voucher in the wastebasket and said nothing, but she picked up her phone and wrote down the date and time in her personal notes, with the particular care of someone preserving a record. None of them knew that the man who had just walked out of the garage was one of perhaps a dozen people alive who understood why the Aurelian V12X behaved the way it did. The Malibu Charity Showcase was held at a beachfront estate that had been converted into an event venue for the season, its long motor court dressed in gallery lighting and lined with 12 of the most significant automobiles in private American ownership. Collectors flew in from Denver and Dallas and New York. A pair of European investors arrived by helicopter. 3 automotive journalists occupied a reserved table near the stage with their cameras loaded, and the atmosphere was the kind that Celeste Mercer operated in naturally, wealth performing itself without apology, reputation built in the margins between what you owned and how you displayed it. The Aurelian V12X sat on a low platform at the center of the main stage, draped until the moment of reveal, and Celeste had ordered custom lighting for the unveiling. Cool blue before the cloth dropped, warm gold after. She had written her remarks herself. 2 minutes about her father's legacy, 3 about the machine's place in American engineering history, and a final 40 seconds on what it meant to bring this prototype forward as a symbol of the Mercer Family Foundation's next chapter. If it went well, the Foundation's investment syndicate would see unified, capable stewardship. If it went well, Bryce would have nothing to bring to the board. The cloth came down on schedule and the room responded correctly. Cameras lifted, the murmur became a low, impressed silence, and Celeste took her position behind the wheel with the composed certainty of someone who had rehearsed this in her mind a dozen times. She turned the key. The Aurelian made one short, mechanical sound, dry and without promise, and then went completely silent. She turned the key again. The dashboard lit with 3 amber warnings. A faint chemical smell, not burning but close, drifted out from the engine compartment and reached the first row of seats before anyone could react. The murmur returned, but it was a different murmur. One of the journalists lowered his camera and typed something. A collector near the back leaned toward his companion and spoke behind his hand. Bryce Langston stood to the left of the stage with his arms loosely folded, and if someone had studied his face carefully enough in that moment, they would have noticed that his expression was not concerned. It was the face of a man watching something arrive on schedule. Celeste stepped down from the vehicle with the deliberate calm of someone managing collapse in real time, signaled Tessa with 2 fingers, and moved through the room to the side corridor, where she stood in a strip of indirect light and tried to remember the last time something had failed this publicly. Warren Tate found her there 15 minutes later, the oldest man on the garage staff, who had overseen the Mercer collection since before Celeste had inherited it, and who knew each car's temperament the way a keeper knows animals in his care. He told her he was sorry about the showcase. Then he said something she hadn't expected. Whatever that mechanic diagnosed before you let him go, I think he was right. Celeste made calls before the last guests had left the estate. The most respected European supercar workshop on the West Coast sent 2 engineers by 10 that evening. They opened the Aurelian's hood under the motor court lights, studied the engine layout for a long time without touching anything, and then asked for documentation on the dual ignition architecture. When Celeste told them it was a one-of-one prototype and standard documentation didn't exist, the senior engineer looked at his partner with an expression that communicated a professional retreat. A second specialist arrived the next morning, a man who had worked on 3 other Aurelian-adjacent projects during a brief licensing period, the most confident of the group and the quickest to concede defeat, because he recognized faster than the others that the fault was not in any component he could access by conventional means. The dual start system of the V12X was not just unusual engineering. It was a proprietary sequence developed outside the standard manufacturer pipeline by a separate test team under a private contract that had been quietly dissolved years ago, existing in no manual and in no database, and to work on it without knowing how it had been built was to operate blindly inside a mechanism that cost $20 million to assemble and an afternoon to destroy. If the wrong adjustment gets made, you're not looking at a repair bill, the specialist told Celeste plainly. You're looking at the permanent loss of the original drivetrain. He recommended shipping the car to a restoration house in Stuttgart. The timeline was 4 to 6 weeks minimum. Celeste told him she needed the car operational in 18 hours. He handed back the keys. Warren Tate had been standing near the garage entrance throughout both consultations, watching without interfering, and after the second specialist's van disappeared down the motor court, he followed Celeste inside and said what he had been carrying since the afternoon of the showcase. The mechanic who had been dismissed 3 days earlier had identified the fault within his first 20 minutes of looking at the car. Not the surface fault, the actual fault. Warren had watched from across the garage and seen the moment it registered, the slight change in posture, the focused stillness that came over a man when the problem was no longer abstract but located. He knew something about that car that neither of those specialists knows, Warren told her. If Weston Hail can't fix it, I don't think anyone in California can. The words settled into the room with a weight Celeste didn't want to accommodate. Bryce, who had arrived during the second consultation, immediately objected. A dismissed contractor with an unresolved grievance had no business being brought back into contact with a $20 million asset. He said it professionally and calmly, with the surface logic that had always made him effective in boardrooms. But something in his speed, the quickness of his objection, the way he reached for the counter-argument before Warren had finished speaking, registered in a part of Celeste's attention she had not been listening to closely enough. Tessa approached after Bryce stepped out to take a call and chose her words with care. Weston Hail hadn't just been let go. He had been publicly embarrassed and denied wages he'd earned, and if Celeste was going to ask him back, a phone call with a dollar amount wasn't going to be enough. She went alone. She didn't tell Bryce. She told Tessa she was handling a personal errand and took her own car, heading east on surface streets that got quieter and less deliberate the further she went from the coast. The neighborhood where Weston's garage sat was the kind of place that had no opinion about what happened on the other side of the city, and the garage itself was a 2-bay standalone on a corner lot, with a hand-painted sign that had once been white. A corrugated overhead door rolled halfway up, and the sound of a socket wrench coming from inside. Weston was working on a heavy pickup, lying on a creeper with the undercarriage open. He heard her car and slid out, and whatever he had expected from his week, it had not been Celeste Mercer standing in the entrance of his garage in a coat that cost more than the truck he was working on. He didn't react with surprise or satisfaction. He stood, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and waited. Celeste had prepared what she intended to say, and in the car it had sounded controlled and managerial. A clear offer, a fair rate, a mutual benefit framed in the language of professional transaction. Standing now on his floor, with the smell of motor oil and burned coffee and the photograph taped to the workbench showing a boy at around 6 years old giving a thumbs up beside a small engine he apparently helped disassemble, her prepared language collapsed of its own weight. She said she needed him to come back and look at the Aurelian. He said he'd been released from that job. She said she was prepared to offer significant compensation. He said the compensation wasn't the problem. He said it plainly, without embellishment, the way someone states a fact that is not in dispute. She had torn up his invoice in front of her employees, told them, by implication, that 3 days of careful diagnostic work was worth nothing, and sent him out of the building in a way that was designed to be witnessed. He said he was not a man who spent 3 days learning something difficult and accepted being told. The work didn't count because the outcome was inconvenient for someone's schedule. Celeste felt something she was not accustomed to feeling in professional contexts, which was that she was on the losing side of a completely fair argument. She had no counterpoint because there was none. She had behaved badly, and the man across from her had not, and that asymmetry was now load-bearing. He set out 4 conditions with the clarity of someone who had thought this through. Full payment of the original invoice. A formal apology delivered in front of the garage staff who had witnessed the dismissal, a new contract drawn through his attorney Holden Barrett, and no access to the repair process for Bryce Langston under any circumstances. Celeste asked why specifically Bryce. Weston said he would explain when he was back in front of the car. She stood in the entrance of his two-bay garage and understood for the first time in her adult life what it felt like to need something that money alone couldn't buy. Not because the amount was insufficient, but because the person across from her required something that had nothing to do with the amount. She said, quietly and without her CEO voice, "I need your help." It was not a request in the way she normally made requests. It was a different thing entirely. Holden Barrett arrived at the Malibu property early the next morning with a contract that ran to 7 pages, which was 6 more than Bryce Langston expected and 3 more than he considered acceptable. The document acknowledged the original unpaid wages with interest, established a clear fee structure for the restoration work, included a liability clause protecting Weston from any allegation related to pre-existing damage to the vehicle, and explicitly restricted access to the vehicle during the repair process to a named list of individuals. Bryce's name was not on it. He objected through every available channel, to Celeste directly, to the building's legal team, to 2 board members. He called for a coffee that had apparently been about something else entirely, and when he finished, Holden said the contract was available to sign as written, or the job would not proceed. Celeste signed it. When Weston arrived that afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted in the complex way atmospheres shift when the power structure in a room has changed and everyone knows it, but no one has announced it. The men who had smirked 3 days earlier found reasons to be looking at other things. Tessa met Weston at the entrance and asked what he needed. He asked for the parts log from the date of his original visit forward, the garage access log for the same period, and the original technical file on the Aurelian if Warren had located it. He also asked Celeste in the presence of the garage staff for what they had agreed to, and she stood in the center of the floor and said clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear that she had been wrong to dismiss him without pay, that his work had been professional and accurate, and that she was sorry for the way she had behaved. It was not a long apology. It did not try to explain the circumstances or rebalance the scale. It was the direct kind, which is the only kind that lands. Weston received it without ceremony, thanked her, and went back to the engine. Bryce moved toward the vehicle, and Weston said, without looking up, "That's far enough." Bryce said he had a right to observe maintenance on a company asset. Weston said the contract he'd just signed gave him the right to ask Bryce to stay back, and if Bryce preferred to dispute that, Holden was still in the building. Within 15 minutes of opening the engine compartment, Weston confirmed what he had suspected since the day Celeste sent him away. The secondary module in the dual start sequence had not failed. It had been replaced, carefully, by someone who knew where it sat and how to reach it without disturbing the surrounding components. The substitute was well made, deliberately chosen to resemble the original at a glance, while being functionally incompatible. This was not a mechanical failure, it was a removal, performed by someone with knowledge, access, and a reason. He said nothing to the room. He wrote 2 words on a notepad, folded it, and passed it to Holden, who read it and put it in his pocket, and then asked Warren to bring over the parts inventory log and the access history from the past 2 weeks. Celeste had always understood the Aurelian V12X in the language she was comfortable with. Asset value, provenance, insurance rider, estate clause. She knew it had been built under a private development contract her father had partly funded, knew it was the only completed prototype, knew it had been tested in Nevada, and quietly retired to the collection when the manufacturer dissolved the associated project. She had never known the specifics because the specifics had never seemed relevant. It was valuable and it was hers, and that had been enough. Weston explained things to her that evening, in a way that made her understand she had been holding an object she didn't actually know. The Aurelian V12X was not simply a rare car. It was the physical result of a technical experiment that had never been formally published or patented. Its dual ignition system had been designed by a small team operating outside the standard engineering documentation process, which was why no manual existed and why modern specialists couldn't work on it. The system required a specific calibration sequence at startup, a sequence that existed in two places: a set of handwritten testing notes in a private archive and the working memory of the engineers who had been on the original team. Weston had been on the team. Not in a central role, he had been in his late 20s, one of several junior test engineers working a sub-project on ignition timing under a senior technician he still regarded with respect. He had not designed the car, but he had spent 18 months calibrating the exact system that was now refusing to start. And that sequence was embedded in him the way certain kinds of learned precision become part of the body rather than the mind. He didn't consult notes. He didn't need them. He told this to Celeste without drama, the way a person states a biographical fact. Tessa, who had been searching the archive of old development records since the previous day, arrived while he was speaking and set a printed scan on the table. A partial personnel log from the original Aurelian project, dated nearly 2 decades earlier. Weston Hail was on it, listed as a secondary test engineer for ignition systems, his name typed and unremarkable, one of 11 on the page. Celeste looked at it for a long time and thought about the morning she'd told a room of 5 people that a man's 3 days of work was worth nothing. About the invoice she had torn in a gesture she had believed, in the moment, communicated appropriate authority. Warren had recognized something in Weston that she hadn't because she hadn't bothered to look. Weston watched her work through this and said nothing until she looked up, and then he said, "You didn't need to know my name. You only needed to pay the person who did the work." It was not said with bitterness or performance. It was the plainest possible version of what was true. She asked why he had taken the job in the first place. Why come to a call-in rate when he clearly had a background that could have positioned him differently? He was quiet for a moment, then nodded toward the small photograph clipped to his toolbox, the boy with the thumbs up and the disassembled engine. He said his son had a medical appointment coming up that wasn't cheap. The rate Tessa had quoted was fair, and the description of the car had been enough for him to recognize what he was dealing with. He said none of that was a complaint. It was just how things were. The parts vault for the Mercer collection was a secured cabinet in the rear of the facility, climate-controlled, cataloged by Warren on a rolling basis. The access log was biometric, fingerprint entry with a time-stamped record, and 5 individuals had clearance: Celeste, Warren, Tessa, Bryce, and the building's head of security. Warren printed the log for the past 3 weeks across 4 pages. Weston went through it line by line with Holden beside him. What they were looking for was the window, the time between Weston's first arrival, when he had identified the fault but not yet been given full access, and the showcase event, when the car had failed to start. The access log showed Warren entering on routine maintenance schedule. It showed Celeste entering once for documentation. It showed Tessa entering twice with Celeste's authorization. It showed Bryce entering the vault at 11:47 at night, 2 days before Weston had been dismissed, for a duration of 14 minutes, under a logged reason that read, "Routine insurance asset verification." Holden underlined the entry. 14 minutes was a long time for a financial executive to spend in a parts vault on a night visit classified as routine, and Warren confirmed he had not been informed of or present for that visit. The facility cameras covered the vault entrance but not the interior. The footage showed Bryce entering with a small case that was not the standard documentation satchel associated with insurance audits, and exiting 14 minutes later with the same case. which appeared heavier on the way out. Bryce was informed the footage was under review. He said it was a matter of routine oversight and that he welcomed scrutiny. He said calmly, without visible discomfort, that anyone looking to implicate him should consider that a dismissed contractor with a financial grievance had far more motivation to tamper with an asset than a CFO who had worked loyally for Mercer Global for 9 years. And he said it fluently, and Celeste watched him say it, and found, for the first time, that the fluency itself was uncomfortable. Weston noted one more thing, standing beside the open vault, stating it as a technical observation rather than an accusation. The substitute component installed in the Aurelian's ignition had been placed in a position requiring specific knowledge of the car's internal layout. Not textbook knowledge, but the positional familiarity someone would gain from a detailed review of the original parts inventory. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that there was a particular archival lubricant used in the vault's component storage trays, amber in color, distinctive, and that he had noticed a small amber stain on the outside edge of Bryce's left dress shoe during the prior day's meeting, the kind of stain that happened when a sole contacted a tray edge while reaching into deep storage. Tessa had been conducting her own search in parallel. She had gone through the executive calendar for the week surrounding the showcase and found that Bryce had scheduled an extraordinary board session. Not a routine session, a governance review, to begin the morning after the event. Its stated purpose was the assessment of executive capacity in managing family legacy assets. It had been scheduled before the showcase took place, before anyone could have known the car would fail, unless they already knew why it would. Celeste sat with that information for a long time without speaking. The board session was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Weston had the night. He was working without the original control module, which was gone, and a replacement could not be ordered because the component was a one-of-one prototype with no commercial equivalent. What he had was a set of handwritten testing notes that Warren had located in a sealed folder inside the facility's historical documentation box, incomplete, partially water-stained, covering approximately 60% of the dual start calibration sequence, and 18 months of embodied technical memory from a time when he had been 27 years old and the car had still been a living project. He also had a components tray of testing spares Warren had preserved on instinct. Old stock from the original program, never cataloged in the main inventory, simply kept in a separate box for years. One of those spares was a partial function ignition relay that could not replace the missing module, but could, in theory, be modified to route the startup sequence through an alternate path. Not the correct solution, but an engineering workaround in a machine that had not been designed with workarounds in mind, which would either function or damage components that couldn't be replaced. Weston worked without announcing what he was doing in real time. Tessa read sections of the testing notes aloud at his request, steady and accurate. Warren positioned lights and prepared tools without being asked, the practiced efficiency of someone who understood what was needed before it was spoken. Celeste stood near the far wall, outside the working radius, watching. It was somewhere in that long watch that something shifted in her understanding, not of the car but of the work. She had spent her career in environments where expertise showed itself in presentations, in transaction structures, in the language of risk-adjusted return and strategic positioning. She had never considered that this, a man in a stained jacket working in precise silence on a mechanism most people alive couldn't describe, was also expertise, and that it made the same demands and deserved the same respect. She had not thought about it before because she had never needed to. Around 2 in the morning, Weston attempted a partial startup to test the relay routing. The engine turned over twice and stopped. Bryce appeared at the entrance with 2 members of the legal team and said he wanted to observe the repair attempt on behalf of the board. Celeste told him, The room was restricted under the active contract and asked him to leave. Bryce said the restriction clause had not been validated by full board review. Holden said it was a signed bilateral agreement and didn't require board validation. Bryce said this was exactly the kind of situation that proved a contracted mechanic should not have operational authority over a company asset. Weston said, without raising his voice, "The car doesn't need this conversation. It needs the room to be quiet so I can hear where the fault is." He turned back to the engine. Bryce left. Not immediately, and not happily, but he left. The second attempt, near 4 in the morning, produced 2 full rotations of the engine and a brief sustained note before the sequence interrupted again at the same point. Weston identified the interruption. A specific timing offset in the relay path, a fraction of a degree, the kind of variance that only existed because the component had been manufactured for a slightly different ignition architecture and adapted rather than built for this position. He made the adjustment by hand with a tool he had ground to a custom angle years ago for exactly this kind of internal clearance work. He asked everyone to stand back. Everyone moved. The board session was due to begin in under 5 hours. 2 board members had agreed to arrive 30 minutes early to the motor court, and a small group had gathered there by 6 in the morning. The board members, Warren, Tessa, Holden, 3 collectors who had witnessed the showcase failure and asked to return, and a pair of journalists who covered the collector market and had been quietly invited by someone who understood that what happened next would need witnesses. Bryce arrived with the rest of the board and stood to one side, maintaining the expression of a man who has prepared for a particular outcome and intends to hold it. The Aurelian V12X sat in the motor court in early marine light, its bodywork catching the gray-gold quality this stretch of coastline carried in the hour before full sun. A car built without compromise for a purpose that had never been fully explained, which was precisely what it was. Weston stood beside it in the same jacket he'd worn 3 days ago when he walked out of the glass-walled garage without a cent for his work. He looked at the car. Celeste said, "Are you sure about this?" He said, "I was sure 3 days ago." No one wanted to hear it then. He opened the driver's door and settled into the seat with the practiced ease of someone who recognized the geometry of the cockpit from the inside, placed his right hand on the ignition, paused for exactly the length of time required by the calibration sequence. A pause that looked like hesitation but was actually a countdown, and turned the key. 1 second of silence. 2. Then the V12 found its register and climbed from a low structural growl into a full, sustained note that filled the entire motor court with a presence that seemed to displace the ambient sound rather than compete with it. The idle settled into a rhythm that was steady and deep and unmistakably healthy. The dashboard cleared, all instrument readings stabilized. Nobody spoke for a moment. The journalists raised their cameras. Warren exhaled slowly through his nose and closed his eyes briefly, the way a person reacts when something they were genuinely uncertain would happen has happened. The 2 board members looked at each other and then at the car. One of the collectors, a man who had told his associate after the showcase that the drivetrain was probably gone, turned a shade of color that suggested he was revising several assumptions. Bryce's face did not change, but the stillness of it was now doing different work. It was no longer the confidence of someone watching a plan unfold. It was the composure of someone watching a plan fail. Weston stepped out without a word and Warren moved in immediately to read the instrument panel, speaking in a low, rapid voice. The secondary ignition path was routing cleanly, the timing was within acceptable variance. The temperature differential across the block was within half a degree of original specification. He said quietly, so that only Tessa and Holden heard clearly. He didn't just fix it. He corrected a calibration error that was present in the original assembly. The car is running better than it ever did. One of the collectors offered $25 million on the spot. Another said 30. Celeste didn't respond to either. She was looking at Weston, who had walked back to the periphery of the motor court, and was listening to the engine with the focused attention of someone hearing something. Only they know how to hear. Holden Barrett opened the board session with a procedural motion to admit evidence before agenda items were addressed. Bryce objected and was overruled by the chair, who said that if there was material relevant to the assessment of executive capacity and asset management, the session's stated purpose, it should be presented first. Holden presented it in chronological order. The garage access log with Bryce's 14-minute vault entry highlighted, the corridor camera footage showing the case on the way in and the heavier case on the way out, the email chain Tessa had located in which Bryce communicated with an investment group about acquisition terms for the Mercer collection contingent on what the emails described as a transition of management authority, and the extraordinary board session Bryce himself had scheduled before the showcase, before any failure had occurred, to review executive capacity in legacy asset management. Holden spoke for 11 minutes without raising his voice. He did not use the word fraud. He used the phrases undisclosed conflict of interest, deliberate interference with a controlled asset, and premeditated maneuver to influence governance outcomes, precise enough to be actionable and careful enough to be correct. Bryce countered with the available arguments. The vault visit was documented and routine. The investment emails were speculative. The early board scheduling was simply preparation for a scenario he believed was likely given what he described as Celeste's history of emotional attachment to the collection. He said none of it constituted misconduct and that the real issue was a dismissed contractor given an implausible degree of authority over company property. He said all of this fluently and well, as he always did, and Celeste watched him say it and found that the fluency itself was now the problem. Weston spoke briefly and without preamble when the chair invited technical commentary. He said the substitute module installed in the Aurelian's ignition system was a non-commercial component not available through standard procurement channels. The kind of part accessible from one source. The archival inventory of the original development program held in the vault. The component could not have been sourced without vault access and specific knowledge of its location within that inventory. He said he had no way to prove who had placed it in the car, but he could demonstrate mechanically that placing it required familiarity with the Aurelian's internal architecture. The precise familiarity someone would gain from 14 minutes alone inside the archive. Warren confirmed the vault log. Tessa confirmed the email timeline. The head of building security confirmed the footage. Bryce's composure held until the board chair asked him directly whether he had removed any original components from collection storage during his vault visit. He said he had not. The chair looked at the exit footage timestamp and said nothing further. The silence did what it needed to do. Celeste exercised the emergency suspension authority built into the executive charter before the session formally closed. She suspended Bryce's access to all Mercer global financial systems, directed outside counsel to retain everything Holden had presented, and requested the board defer the governance review agenda until the conflict investigation was complete. The board agreed without a vote. Bryce was escorted from the premises by building security, and before the elevator doors closed, Weston said one thing to the room in general, in the way a person says something that has been true for a while and is simply now observable. Pay the people who do the work before you need them to save you. It's less expensive. The 3 weeks that followed were quiet in the way things are quiet after a structural event. Not peaceful exactly, but settled. The kind of stillness that comes when a load has been redistributed and the building has stopped moving. Mercer Global Ventures released a brief public statement about a personnel matter. The collector media ran the Aurelian V12X story, with enough detail to satisfy the market and not enough to expose the internal mechanics of what had happened. 2 collectors made formal acquisition inquiries. Celeste declined both. The thing she was thinking about most in those 3 weeks was not the board session or the legal proceedings grinding forward on their own momentum. It was a 2-minute conversation she'd had with Warren Tate in the corridor after everything concluded. She had asked him whether she could have known, whether Weston's background was something she should have seen. Warren had said no. She couldn't have known his background from looking at him. But she could have paid him, and she hadn't, and the reason she hadn't was not that she believed he hadn't done the work. The reason was that she had assumed the judgment of the man standing next to her who had an incentive she hadn't considered. She thought about that for 3 weeks. On a Tuesday morning, she drove herself to Weston's garage. She brought the full payment, the original invoice, the accumulated interest, the contracted restoration fee, and an additional amount her accountant described as a goodwill settlement, and that she thought of as closer to a correction. She had also prepared a written document, 2 paragraphs, drafted by herself and not her legal team, that said simply and directly what had been done wrong and by whom. Holden Barrett was already at the garage when she arrived, which was not a surprise. The full garage staff was present, the 3 mechanics and 1 apprentice who had been mentioned in Weston's conditions. Celeste stood on the floor, not behind Hetzk, and read the 2 paragraphs aloud. Weston Hail had performed professional work with full competence, had been denied payment in a manner that was both wrong and public, and she was correcting that wrong in the same company and in the same public manner. She said she had been operating under the influence of someone who had reason to want her to behave badly, but that this did not diminish her own responsibility for the choice she had made. Weston accepted the payment without fanfare, folded the check, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he said he had read the consulting offer Holden had delivered on her behalf and wanted to discuss one thing. He said he would not take a retained specialist role or any kind of representative position for Mercer Global's public positioning. He had seen what happened when people with tools got used as props by people with platforms, and he had no interest in being someone's redemption story. He said there was one arrangement he would consider. Mercer Global Ventures had the resources and the reach to establish a legitimate apprenticeship program, not a public relations initiative with a name on a building, but an actual pipeline from vocational training into restoration work and rare vehicle engineering, the kind of hands-on technical education that had largely been stripped from the school systems his son and the children of people like him attended. He said there were more people who could do what he did, could have done what he did on the night of the restore, if they had ever been given the chance to learn it properly. He said the only thing he had seen in 30 years that was rarer than a working Aurelian V12X was a young person from a working-class neighborhood getting a genuine path into precision engineering. Celeste agreed. She didn't negotiate the terms. She didn't route it through 3 committees. She said yes. Several weeks later, at a new showcase, a smaller event, a private preview for the Foundation's restoration initiative, a reporter asked Celeste directly who had saved the Aurelian V12X. She was standing near the motor court entrance, and Weston was 20 feet away in his faded jacket, watching the engine run with the same focused quiet he had brought to every room she'd seen him in. She said, "The man I was foolish enough not to pay the first time." 3 days before that moment, Celeste Mercer had thought she was saving herself a few $100s by refusing a mechanic's invoice. 3 weeks later, she understood that the most valuable thing in her garage had never been the $20 million car. It was the one man patient enough, skilled enough, and steady enough to make it run again.